The wind had a name in this part of the country, but no one bothered to use it anymore. It was simply the wind, a constant, rasping breath that scoured the land until it was raw. It lifted the topsoil from fields that had given up on corn and prayer alike, spinning it into pale, ghostly funnels that danced across the horizon. The sun was a hammer, beating down from a sky the color of bleached bone, and the earth had surrendered, cracking into 1,000 dry fissures that looked like a map of a world lost to thirst. What few crops remained were skeletal, their brittle stalks rattling a song of defeat against the baked ground. This was a land that promised nothing and delivered on that promise with brutal consistency. Through this unforgiving emptiness, a lone wagon groaned, its wheels complaining with every turn. It was a small, plain thing, drawn by a single tired horse whose ribs showed like the hoops on a barrel. At the reins sat Eleanor Hart, a woman who looked as broken as the landscape around her. They called her Ellie. The name felt small and soft, a relic from another life where such things mattered. The woman holding the leather straps was neither small nor soft. She was a creature of sharp angles and hollows, carved out by fear. A bruise, ugly and purple, blossomed across her left cheekbone, a violent flower against the pale canvas of her skin. Her lip was split, and she tasted the coppery tang of dried blood whenever she pressed her mouth into a thin, determined line. Her hands, wrapped loosely around the reins, were the worst. The knuckles were scraped raw, the skin torn away in ragged patches where she had fought back. Her fingernails broken down to the quick. She had fled in the dead of night, taking nothing but the horse, the wagon, and the clothes on her back, fleeing a man the world saw as respectable, a man who had built a small empire in cattle trading, a man who saw her as his most private, most damaged possession, a man who, just hours ago, had shown her the back of his hand for the last time. The thought of him, his name, his face, the scent of whiskey and stale cigar smoke that clung to him, sent a tremor through her. She pushed it down, deep into the cold, hard place inside her that had been growing for 5 years. Fear was a luxury she could no longer afford. All that mattered was the horizon, a flat, endless line that promised distance, if not safety. A sudden, jarring crack echoed in the oppressive silence, followed by the sickening splinter of wood. The wagon lurched violently to one side, throwing Ellie against the sideboard. The horse whinnied in alarm and stumbled to a halt. The right rear wheel had given way. Its spokes shattered. The whole assembly canted at an impossible angle. It was finished. Ellie stared at the broken wheel, a wave of despair so profound it almost buckled her. She had pushed the horse, and herself, for 2 days without rest, fueled by a terror that burned hotter than the sun. Now, in the middle of nowhere, she was stranded. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the panting of the horse and the whisper of the wind. To the south, the flat plains gave way to the jagged teeth of a canyon, its shadows deep and unwelcoming. It looked like a wound in the earth. She unhitched the horse, its hide slick with sweat, and led it toward the canyon's rim. Her movements were stiff, her body a symphony of aches. Water was the priority. She had a small canteen, now nearly empty, and a half loaf of stale bread wrapped in cloth. It was not enough. As she scanned the desolate terrain, her eyes caught on something unnatural against the backdrop of rock and scrub, the sagging roofline of a structure, almost completely swallowed by the landscape. An old line shack, perhaps, abandoned by prospectors or sheepherders years ago. It was a miserable hovel, little more than 4 crumbling walls and a roof with more holes than timber. But it was shelter. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. A rusted wood stove stood in one corner, a rickety table and a single chair its only companions. But in the back, tucked under the eaves, she found a miracle, a rain barrel, still a quarter full of murky, stagnant water. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. For days, that shack became her world, She drank the bitter water, straining it through a piece of her petticoat. She ate the last of her bread, crumb by crumb, making it last. She let the horse graze on the sparse, wiry grass that grew in the shadow of the canyon walls. Mostly, she hid. Whenever the wind carried the faint sound of a rider or a distant wagon, she would shrink into the darkest corner of the shack, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, her hand clutching the one thing she had thought to steal from her husband's office, a heavy, rust-pitted revolver. She did not know if it would even fire, but its cold weight in her hand was a small comfort against the vast, terrifying emptiness. She was a ghost in a ghost cabin, surviving on scraps and fear, waiting for a danger she could not see but felt in her bones. Caleb Rowan rode with an economy of motion that spoke of long years in the saddle. He sat his horse not as a rider, but as a part of the animal itself, moving with its rhythm, his eyes constantly scanning the land. He was a man made of the same sun-beaten, wind-scoured material as the plains he called home. His face was weathered, creased at the corners of his eyes from squinting into the sun. His jaw set in a line that suggested a man who did not waste words. He was tracking 2 stray yearlings that had broken from the main herd, their tracks leading him straight toward the mouth of Whisper Canyon. It was a place most folks avoided. The ground was treacherous, and local stories claimed it was haunted by the spirits of prospectors who had gone in searching for gold and never come out. Caleb put little stock in such tales. He believed in what he could see: rock, sun, and the stubborn resilience of a good horse. As he neared the canyon's edge, his horse pricked its ears, its head turning toward a dilapidated shack he had not paid mind to in years. It was meant to be empty, but a faint wisp of smoke, thin as a thread, curled from the leaning stone chimney. He dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, his hand resting near the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. He was not a man who looked for trouble, but he had learned long ago to be ready for it. The air was still, the only sound the crunch of his boots on the gravelly soil. He approached the shack from the side, staying out of line of the single, grimy window. The door was a slab of weathered planks, hanging crookedly on leather hinges. It was slightly ajar. He nudged it open with the toe of his boot. The interior was dark, but he could make out a figure huddled in the far corner, small and still. A woman. Then he saw the glint of metal, a rusty revolver, clutched in 2 trembling hands, was pointing directly at his chest. "Stay back," a voice rasped, thin and brittle. Caleb stopped, raising his hands slowly, palms open. He saw the terror in her eyes, wide and stark in the dim light. He saw the dark bruise on her face, the split lip. He saw the raw, bloodied state of her knuckles. This was not a threat. It was a cornered animal, ready to lash out from sheer fright. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and calm, the way he would speak to a spooked horse. "I am not here to cause you harm. I saw the smoke, thought I would check on it." "There is nothing to check on," she said, the gun wavering. Her determination was a fragile thing, betrayed by the violent tremor in her arms. "My name is Caleb Rowan. I own the ranch north of here. I was just tracking a couple of lost strays." He took a careful step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. He was trying to show her that he was not a danger, that the space between them was safe. "That is a rough-looking weapon you have there. Old cap and ball. You best be careful with it. Sometimes they go off when you do not want them to." Ellie flinched at his step, her finger tightening on the trigger. Her mind screamed at her to shoot, to run, to do anything but stay frozen in this man's quiet, steady gaze. He was big, his shoulders broad under his dusty shirt, his presence filling the small, cramped space. He was everything she was running from, but his eyes, they were not cruel. They were watchful, patient, and held a surprising sadness she could not place. Caleb saw her finger whiten on the trigger, with a movement that was impossibly swift yet gentle. He closed the distance between them, his large, calloused hand closing over hers. carefully enveloping the revolver. He did not snatch it. He simply held her hands within his thumb pressing down on the hammer to hold it in place. Her skin was cold as ice. She gasped, a small, choked sound. And for a moment he felt the desperate, frantic struggle in her grip. Then, as if every ounce of strength had drained out of her, her fingers went limp. He carefully worked the gun from her grasp and tucked it into his own belt. "There now," he said softly, stepping back to give her space. "No need for that." Ellie sagged against the wall, her breath coming in ragged sobs. The dam of her control had broken, and shame washed over her in a hot, sickening wave. She was weak, foolish, and utterly alone. Caleb looked around the miserable shack, taking in the empty canteen, the last few crumbs of bread on a piece of cloth, the pitiful rain barrel. He saw the broken wagon just over the rise. He pieced the story together in silence. Runaway. Trouble. Bad trouble. "Your wagon is busted," he said. It was a statement, not a question. She nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of a bruised hand. "I can fix it," he offered. "The axle looks snapped. I have tools and a spare at my camp. It is not far. I can have you on your way by morning." He paused. "And get you to town. Dry Creek is a day's ride from here." Ellie hesitated, suspicion and fear warring with a desperate, aching need for help. Trusting a man was what had gotten her here in the first place. Her husband's promises had been gentle at first, too, but the thought of staying in this shack another night, of her husband's men finding her, was a far more immediate terror. This man's calm tone, the way he had taken the gun without violence, the way he looked at her not with hunger or pity, but with a quiet, assessing gravity. It was enough. It had to be enough. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. The journey back toward civilization was a slow, quiet affair. Caleb worked on the wagon with a focused, methodical competence, his hands sure and steady as he replaced the broken axle. Ellie watched from a distance, huddled in her shawl despite the heat, feeling exposed and vulnerable under the vast, open sky. She was terrified of his touch, even an accidental brush of his arm as he passed by, and he seemed to sense it. He moved around her with a careful, deliberate distance, never crowding her, never speaking unless necessary. His control was absolute, a stark contrast to her own frayed nerves. She was a bundle of raw, jangled wires. He was a fortress of quiet, impenetrable stone. They made camp as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the clouds in fiery strokes of orange and purple. Caleb built a small fire, its crackle a comforting sound in the deepening twilight. He shared his provisions with her, jerked beef and hardtack, softened in a tin cup of coffee. It was the first real food she had tasted in days, and she ate slowly, trying not to seem as ravenous as she felt. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the sounds of the prairie at night, the chirp of crickets, the lonely call of a distant coyote. The moon rose, a perfect silver disk in a sea of stars, bathing the landscape in a soft, ethereal glow. Under the spell of the moonlight, the world felt quieter, safer. The hard edges of the day had softened. It was Ellie who finally broke the silence. "He said it was because he loved me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She stared into the dancing flames, not looking at him. When he was angry, he said he had to teach me. That pain was his way of showing me how much I belonged to him." Caleb did not move. He continued to stare into the fire, his profile unreadable in the flickering light. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He did not ask questions. He simply sat there, his silence a heavy, absorbent thing. It took her words, her shame, her pain, and gave them a place to rest. In that silence, Ellie felt something she had not felt in years, the solid, unshakable weight of being believed. It was a silence that spoke volumes, that acknowledged the darkness she came from without needing to name it. It was the beginning of a fragile, unspoken understanding between two people who knew that the world was full of wounds, some visible and some not. They arrived in Dry Creek the next afternoon. It was a town that clung to a dusty main street, lined with false-fronted buildings that looked tired and peeling under the relentless sun. It was small enough that a stranger's arrival was an event, and the sight of Ellie Hart, bruised and sitting beside the stoic, well-known rancher Caleb Rowan, was more than an event. It was a scandal in the making. As they rode down the street toward the livery, doors opened a crack, curtains were pulled aside, faces appeared in windows, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and sharp, immediate judgment. Ellie could feel their eyes on her, picking her apart, whispering stories before they even knew her name. They saw a fallen woman, a woman of ill repute, traveling alone with a man who was not her husband. They saw her bruised face and drew their own sordid conclusions. She instinctively pulled her shawl tighter, trying to disappear, but there was nowhere to hide. The cage of her marriage was gone, but she had just walked into another one, its bars forged from the gossip and scorn of a small, unforgiving town. Caleb seemed not to notice the stares, his gaze fixed straight ahead, but Ellie could feel a tension in the set of his shoulders. He had brought her to safety, but they both knew, in that moment, that her troubles were far from over. Caleb Rowan's ranch was not a place of comfort. It was a testament to sheer, unyielding will. The main house was built of thick, hand-hewn logs, chinked with mud and stubbornness against the ceaseless wind. The corrals were sturdy, the barn was solid, and every fence post was sunk deep into the unforgiving earth. It was a man's world, smelling of leather, sweat, and livestock. And into this world, Ellie Hart stepped like a ghost. Caleb gave her the small room off the back of the kitchen, a space no bigger than a closet, and a job. She was to be the cook. The work was a strange kind of salvation. It was hard, honest labor that left her too tired at night to dream. She rose before the sun, her hands already scarred, learning the new textures of flour, dough, and the rough peels of potatoes. She learned the ranch hands by their appetites. Young Billy, who ate as if he were perpetually starving. Jed, the old-timer, who liked his coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in, and the half-dozen others, all of them rough-edged. Weather-beaten men who initially looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and a crude, unspoken curiosity. They watched her as she moved about the cookhouse, her steps quiet, her eyes always downcast. They saw the fading bruise on her cheek and the way she flinched if one of them moved too quickly behind her. In the bunkhouse, after the lanterns were lit, their talk was low and speculative. They traded stories about where she might have come from. Some said she was a widow from a failed homestead. Others, with a knowing wink, suggested she was a woman who had worn out her welcome in some saloon back east. They never said these things to her face, but Ellie felt their whispers like a physical touch, a constant, prickling reminder that she was an outsider, a mystery they were trying to solve. The town of Dry Creek was far less subtle. When Caleb rode in for supplies, the questions were blunt. It was Ruth, who ran the mercantile, who voiced them the loudest. Ruth was a handsome woman, with sharp features and an even sharper tongue. She and Caleb had a history, a thing of convenience and lonely nights that had ended the moment he had ridden into town with Ellie at his side. Ruth saw Ellie not as a person, but as a rival, an insult. "Another stray you've picked up, Caleb?" she asked one afternoon, her voice carrying across the store as she weighed out a bag of beans. Her eyes, hard as agates, were fixed on Ellie, who stood silently by the door. "You always did have a soft spot for creatures with broken wings." Caleb's jaw tightened, but his voice was level. "She is my cousin's girl, from back east. Her family passed. She is helping out at the ranch for a spell." The lie was thin as water, and everyone in the store knew it. A woman like Ellie, with her haunted eyes and bruised skin, was no one's cousin from back east. She was trouble. The story solidified into town gospel. Eleanor Hart was Caleb Rowan's mistress, a kept woman he had installed at his ranch. The women of the town looked through her, their gazes sliding past as if she were made of glass. The men looked at her with a different kind of attention, a leering familiarity that made her skin crawl. The prejudice was a wall, invisible but solid, and Ellie learned to walk with her head down, to make herself small, to expect nothing from anyone but Caleb, and Caleb, in his stoic way, offered a silent, unyielding protection. He never spoke of her past, and his quiet presence was a clear warning to any man who might think of getting too familiar. Autumn bled into winter with a sudden, brutal chill. The sky turned the color of lead, and the wind developed a new, sharper bite. The first snows came, dusting the plains in a fine white powder that quickly turned to a sea of mud, and then froze solid. The world shrank, the boundaries of the ranch becoming the boundaries of their existence. The cold was relentless, seeping through the chinking in the logs and turning every breath into a plume of white vapor. It was during one of these early, vicious storms that Ellie showed a side of herself that no one, least of all Caleb, had expected. A blizzard swept down from the north without warning. A swirling vortex of wind and ice. A dozen newborn calves, still weak and vulnerable, were caught out in the north pasture, separated from their mothers. Without help, they would freeze to death by morning. Caleb was pulling on his heaviest coat, his face grim, when Ellie appeared at his side. A thick wool shawl wrapped around her head and another of his old coats, far too large for her, draped over her small frame. "I am coming with you," she said. It was not a request. "No," Caleb said flatly. "This is not work for you. You will freeze before we are halfway there." "I can ride," she insisted, her chin set in a stubborn line he was beginning to recognize. "And you will need help getting them back. You cannot manage them all alone in this." He looked at her, ready to argue, but something in her eyes stopped him. It was not the fragile fear he was used to seeing. It was a hard, flinty resolve, a fire he had not known she possessed. He saw a woman who had survived far worse than a snowstorm. He gave a curt nod, and a few minutes later, they were riding out into the teeth of the gale. The wind was a physical force, trying to tear them from their saddles. Sleet, sharp as needles, drove into their faces, and the cold was a deep, aching thing that settled into their bones. Ellie rode hunched over her horse's neck, her small figure looking impossibly frail against the overwhelming power of the storm. But she did not complain. She did not falter. When they found the calves, huddled together and crying pitifully, she dismounted without hesitation, her hands, though numb with cold, working to push the shivering animals toward the path back to the barn. Caleb watched her, a strange feeling stirring in his chest. He had seen her only as a victim, a fragile thing he needed to protect, but in the heart of the blizzard, he saw a survivor. They worked for hours, their bodies screaming with effort and cold, until the last calf was safe inside the warm, hay-filled barn. Back in the main house, they stood dripping by the fire, exhausted and half-frozen. The ranch hands, who had been watching from the windows, looked at Ellie with a new, grudging respect. She had earned her place. Later that night, long after the others had gone to the bunkhouse, Caleb and Ellie sat before the hearth. The storm still raged outside, but inside, the fire cast a warm, flickering glow. Caleb had been working on a broken harness, his strong hands moving with practiced skill. Ellie had been darning socks, her own small hands deft with a needle. A comfortable silence had settled between them. Caleb got up and poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a pair of tin cups, handing one to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his for a barest second. She did not pull away. The whiskey was fire in her throat, chasing away the last of the chill. He sat down again, closer than he usually did, and they watched the flames. "Your hands must be frozen," he said, his voice a low rumble. Before she could answer, he reached out and gently took her left hand in his, His touch was not meant to be intimate, merely a practical check, like he might check a horse's hoof for a stone. But for Ellie, it was a cataclysm. Her entire body went rigid. A violent flinch, sharp and involuntary, jerked her hand back. It was a pure, instinctual reaction, born of 5 years of pain. Her breath hitched, and she stared at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and shame. Caleb's hand froze in midair. He did not recoil. He simply held his position, his gaze steady on hers, letting her see that there was no threat in him. He waited, slowly, agonizingly. Ellie forced her own trembling hand to move. She reached out and placed it back in his. His skin was rough, calloused from years of hard labor, but his hold was unbelievably gentle. He simply held her wrist, his thumb resting lightly against the pulse that beat like a trapped bird against her skin. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and unexpected. It was not pain she felt, but the ghost of it, and beneath that ghost, something else, something she had thought long dead, a flicker of warmth, a deep, aching need for this simple, human connection. The conflict was a war inside her. "It hurts," she gasped, the words torn from her throat, her voice thick with unshed tears. She was not talking about his touch. She was talking about all of it, the memory, the fear, the terrifying, bewildering desire to feel something gentle again. "Yet, I crave it." Caleb looked at her, his dark eyes holding an ocean of understanding. He had seen men break in battle, seen the hardest of outlaws weep with guilt. He knew what a wounded soul looked like. He saw the fight in her, the incredible strength it took for her to not pull away, to endure the memory of pain for the promise of something better. His voice, when he finally spoke, was so low she almost did not hear it over the crackle of the fire. "Sweetheart," he whispered, the name a soft, rough caress. "You are tougher than fire." He released her hand, and the moment was over. But nothing was the same. That night, a new kind of intimacy was born between them, one built not on words or passion, but on the silent acknowledgement of mutual wounds. They were two broken people, finding a strange sort of wholeness in each other's company. But as the winter deepened, the world outside the ranch refused to leave them be. The rumors in Dry Creek had festered, growing uglier. The story of the bruised woman at the Rowan Ranch had traveled, carried by merchants and itinerant preachers, and eventually it reached the ears of the law. The town sheriff, a portly man named Abernathy, who owed more than a few favors to powerful cattlemen, rode out to the ranch one afternoon. He found Caleb splitting wood, the axe rising and falling with a steady, metronomic rhythm. "Caleb," the sheriff said, not dismounting, "been hearing some talk about the woman you have got staying here." Caleb did not stop his work. The axe bit into a log with a sharp crack. "What kind of talk, Sheriff?" "The kind that says she might be a runaway wife, from a man with money and influence, a man who is asking questions." Sheriff Abernathy shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "I am just saying, harboring another man's property can lead to a whole heap of trouble." The axe stopped. Caleb leaned it against the woodpile and turned to face the sheriff, his eyes cold. "She is a relative, and she is under my protection. Is that clear?" The sheriff held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. "Just delivering a message. Caleb, be careful." He turned his horse and rode off, leaving a cloud of cold air in his wake. That evening, Caleb found Ellie by the window, watching the snow fall. The threat was no longer a distant whisper. It was at their door. "He will find me," she said quietly. It was not a question. "I can send you away," Caleb offered, his voice rough. "I know a man who runs a stage line north. I can give you money. You could go to Oregon, maybe California. Start over, where no one knows you." He was offering her an escape, a way out. He was offering to save her. A few weeks ago, she would have taken it without a second thought. But something had changed. In the quiet solitude of the ranch, in the shared hardship of the storm, in the gentle touch of his hand by the fire. She had found something she had not realized she was looking for, a reason to stop. She turned from the window to face him, and for the first time, there was no fear in her eyes, only a weary, resolute strength. "No," she said, her voice clear and firm. "I am done running." The winter did not release its grip so much as it was burned away. The snow melted not into nourishing streams that fed the earth, but evaporated under a sun that returned with a vengeance. Spring arrived, but it brought no relief. The sky remained a vast, empty blue, mocking the parched land below. The creeks dwindled, and the grass that pushed through the soil was thin and pale, turning brown almost as soon as it grew. A deep, stubborn drought settled over the plains, and with it came a palpable tension. Tempers grew short as the dust, and whispers of trouble on the range became a common currency. With the law spread thin and ranches isolated, desperate men began to form gangs, riding in the night to steal livestock from those who could least afford to lose it. Caleb's ranch was not immune. One morning, Jed, his oldest hand, reported a dozen head of cattle missing from the western pasture, their tracks heading south toward the lawless territories. A muscle worked in Caleb's jaw. This was more than theft. It was a challenge. He spent the day gathering his most trusted men, cleaning rifles, and packing supplies. Ellie watched him, a cold knot of fear tightening in her stomach. She saw in his movements a quiet, lethal efficiency that she had only glimpsed before. The man preparing to ride out was not just a rancher. He was a man who knew how to meet violence with violence. He rode out at dawn the next day, a silhouette against the rising sun. For 3 days, the ranch held its breath. Ellie threw herself into her work, cooking and cleaning with a ferocity that left no room for thought. But in the quiet moments, her mind would conjure images of him, lying wounded or worse in some desolate gully. She found herself praying, a practice she had abandoned years ago, the words feeling clumsy and strange in her mouth. Caleb and his men found the rustlers' camp tucked into a narrow box canyon. They were careless, emboldened by their recent successes. Caleb approached under the cover of darkness, his movements as silent as a predator's. He recognized the type, hard, desperate men with nothing to lose, but as he got closer, his blood ran cold. One of the men, silhouetted by the campfire, had a familiar posture, a way of holding his head that jolted a memory Caleb had spent a decade trying to bury. He waited until the others were asleep, until only the man from his past was on watch, nursing a bottle of cheap whiskey. Caleb stepped into the firelight, his rifle held low but ready. The man looked up, his eyes widening first in alarm, then in disbelief. "Caleb," the man rasped, his voice rough with shock. "By God, I thought you were dead." "Silas," Caleb said, his voice flat and hard. The name tasted like ash in his mouth. Silas was leaner, his face a roadmap of hard living, but it was the same man who had ridden with him all those years ago, the same man who had been there on that last, disastrous job. "What are you doing here?" Silas stammered, scrambling to his feet. "Folks said you went straight. A rancher," he laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Never figured you for the type." "Those are my cattle you have got penned up," Caleb said, ignoring the taunt. "You are going to open the gate and walk away. You and your men. Leave the horses, the guns, everything. Just walk." Silas stared at him, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. "There are 5 of us, Caleb. Only one of you." "You know me, Silas," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. "You know I will not miss, and my men are in the rocks with rifles aimed at your sleeping friends. You have one chance. Walk away." The 2 men stood locked in a silent battle of wills. Silas saw the man he remembered in Caleb's eyes, the cold, unwavering killer he had once been. The rancher was a costume. The man beneath was unchanged, defeated. Silas nodded slowly, He woke his men with a series of kicks and curses, and a few minutes later, the small band of rustlers was trudging away on foot into the darkness, leaving everything behind. Caleb watched them go, the encounter leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. He had not pulled the trigger, but seeing Silas had ripped open a wound he thought had long since scarred over. Back at the ranch, life continued its precarious rhythm. Young Billy, the most reckless of the hands, was thrown from a horse while trying to break it and came away with a badly broken leg. The bone had torn through the skin, a gruesome, bloody injury that sent the other men into a panic. But Ellie was calm. She took charge immediately, her voice firm and clear as she directed the men to carry him into the main house. She washed the wound, her touch gentle but sure, and with Jed's help, she set the bone as best she could, fashioning a splint from pieces of a wooden crate and torn sheets. For the next 2 weeks, she nursed him tirelessly, changing his bandages, forcing broth between his lips, and sitting with him through the long, feverish nights. Her competence was a quiet marvel. But in town, the story took on a darker shade. Billy's accident, coming on the heels of the rustling and the deepening drought, was seen as more proof of the bad luck the new woman had brought to the Rowan ranch. She was a harbinger of misfortune, a curse. The animosity finally came to a head when Ellie had to ride into Dry Creek for medicine for Billy. The mercantile was quiet when she entered, the handful of customers falling silent, their conversations dying in their throats. Ellie ignored them, her gaze fixed on the shelves as she gathered the items on her list. As she approached the counter, Ruth stepped forward to block her path. "We do not serve your kind here," Ruth said, her voice loud and clear for everyone to hear. Ellie stopped, her heart beginning to pound. "I am here for supplies. Ruth, for one of Caleb's men. He is injured." "I am sure he is," Ruth sneered, her eyes full of venom. "Seems like there has been nothing but trouble out there since you arrived. You are like a sickness, clinging to a good man and poisoning everything around him." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper that still carried through the silent store. "Everyone in this town knows what you are. A man brings a woman like you to his home for one reason and one reason only. You are nothing but a common whore." The word struck Ellie with the force of a physical blow. It was the same word her husband had used, hissing it in her ear during his darkest rages. For a moment, the floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet, the faces of the other customers blurring into a single, judgmental mask. She felt the old, familiar shame rise up, hot and suffocating. She wanted to shrink, to run, to disappear. But then she met Ruth's triumphant gaze, and something else rose up alongside the shame. A spark of defiance. She had survived a blizzard. She had faced down her own terror in a desolate shack. She would not be broken by a bitter woman's words in a general store. Ellie drew herself up to her full, slight height. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. "You can think whatever you like of me," she said, her tone level and cold. "But I will not let a boy suffer because of your hatred. Now, if you will not sell me the medicine, I will take it, and you can tell the sheriff I will be back to pay for it when Caleb is with me." She made a move to step around Ruth, but Ruth did not budge. For a tense moment, the two women stood face to face, locked in a silent standoff. Then, from the back of the store, the old doctor, who had been watching the exchange, spoke up. "Give her the laudanum, Ruth," he said gruffly, "and add it to my account." Humiliated but defeated, Ruth shot Ellie one last look of pure hatred before turning on her heel and stomping away. Ellie paid for her other supplies, her hands shaking slightly as she counted out the coins, and walked out of the store with her head held high. But the moment she was back in the wagon, out of sight of the town, the rigid control she had maintained shattered into 1,000 pieces. Sobs racked her body, born of shame, fury, and a profound, aching loneliness. She did not realize Caleb had seen the whole exchange. He had been at the blacksmith's and had walked over just in time to see her emerge from the store. Her face a pale, proud mask that he now knew was hiding a world of pain. He followed her back to the ranch, keeping his distance, giving her the space she needed. That night, the house was quiet. The hands were in the bunkhouse, and the silence was thick with unspoken things. Ellie moved like an automaton, preparing a simple meal that no one had the heart to eat. After she had cleaned up, Caleb found her sitting on the porch, staring out at the dark, starless sky. "She was right," Ellie said, her voice a dead, hollow thing. "What she called me, that is what he made me feel like. Something used, something dirty, and I cannot wash it off. It does not matter how far I run. The shame owns me." She wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of self-protection that broke Caleb's heart. "Sometimes I think I deserved it, that there is something broken in me that made him." Her voice broke, and she could not finish. Caleb sat down on the steps near her, not touching her, but his presence was a solid, comforting weight in the darkness. He let her cry, her quiet, shuddering sobs the only sound in the vast stillness of the night. When she was finally spent, her tears exhausted, he began to speak, his voice a low, rough murmur. "Shame is a heavy thing to carry," he began. "I know something about it." He paused, and she could feel him gathering the courage to say what came next. "You think you are the only one with a past that haunts them? You think I built all this?" He gestured vaguely at the dark outlines of the barn and the corrals. "Just because I like cattle?" He took a deep breath. "Before this, I was a different man. I rode with a crew. We took what was not ours. One night, we hit a bank in a small town in the territories. It went wrong. There was a clerk, just a boy. Really, he was not armed. He was just scared. He made a move for the alarm bell, and I shot him." The confession hung in the air between them, stark and terrible. Ellie turned to look at him, her own pain momentarily forgotten. In the faint light from the kitchen window, she could see the raw agony etched on his face. "He died right there, on the floor," Caleb continued, his voice thick with a guilt that was still fresh after all these years. "For a bag of money. I never even saw his face clearly. I ran. Like the coward I was, I left that life, changed my name, and came here. I bought this land with my share of that money. Every fence post I have driven, every calf I have branded. It has all been penance. I have been trying to build something that would weigh more on God's scale than the life I took. But it never does. The shame. It does not go away. It just finds a different place to live." They sat in silence. Two souls laid bare in the prairie night. There was no judgment, no pity. There was only a profound, shared understanding of what it meant to be broken. Ellie saw him then, truly saw him for the first time. He was not just a savior, a quiet, strong protector. He was a man as scarred as she was, his wounds just hidden deeper. And in that moment, her feelings for him shifted, crystallizing into something new and powerful. It was not safety she craved from him anymore. It was him. His quiet strength, his hidden pain, his silent penance. She craved the flawed, wounded man who sat beside her, because his brokenness mirrored her own. Caleb, in turn, saw the last of the fragile victim he had first found in the shack fall away. In her place was a woman of fierce, unyielding strength, a woman who had faced down public humiliation and still had the capacity to listen to another's pain. He saw a survivor, an equal, a woman forged in the same kind of fire that had shaped him. The fragile peace of their shared confession was shattered 2 days later by the sound of approaching horses. It was Sheriff Abernathy, and this time he was not alone. He had 2 deputies with him, their faces grim and official. Caleb met them in the yard, his stance wary. "Sheriff," he said, his voice a low warning. Abernathy cleared his throat, avoiding Caleb's eyes. He unrolled a piece of paper. "Caleb, I've got a warrant here, issued by the circuit judge. It is for the arrest of one Eleanor Hart." He looked past Caleb, toward the house where Ellie had just appeared in the doorway. "Her husband, Mr. Alistair Hart, has filed a formal complaint. He claims she stole property from him, a horse, a wagon, and a sum of cash. The law says she is to be taken into custody and returned to him." The warrant was not a piece of paper. It was a chain, reaching across hundreds of miles to drag her back into the hell she had escaped. Ellie saw it in Sheriff Abernathy's hand and felt its cold, phantom weight around her own throat. But Caleb did not flinch. He simply stood between her and the law, a bulwark of solid, unmoving resolve. "The law is the law, Caleb," Abernathy said, his voice carrying a note of strained apology. He was a man who preferred peace, and Caleb Rowan was not a man to be trifled with. "I have to take her in." "No," Caleb said. The word was quiet, yet it carried the weight of finality. "You are not taking her anywhere." "Do not make this difficult," the sheriff pleaded, gesturing to his deputies. "I do not want trouble." "Then you should turn around and ride away," Caleb replied, his gaze like chips of flint. He took a deliberate step forward. "This is my property. The woman is under my protection. You come back with the circuit judge himself. Until then, you are trespassing." Abernathy hesitated. He knew Caleb's reputation. He was a hard man, but fair. He was not a liar or a troublemaker. The sheriff also knew that forcing the issue here, in the middle of nowhere with only 2 nervous deputies for backup, was a fool's errand. He could come back with a posse, but for now, a strategic retreat felt wiser. "You are obstructing justice." "Caleb," he blustered, trying to salvage some authority. "I am giving you 24 hours. You bring her into town by noon tomorrow, or I will come back with 10 men and we will do this the hard way." He wheeled his horse around without waiting for a reply, his deputies following eagerly in his wake. The moment they were out of sight, a cloud of dust on the horizon, Caleb turned to Ellie. The quiet rancher was gone, replaced by a man of swift, decisive action. "We do not have much time," he said, his voice tight. "Get a heavy coat, a blanket, and anything you cannot bear to part with. Meet me at the barn." There was an old, abandoned mine shaft in the hills that bordered Caleb's property, a relic from a failed silver rush decades ago. The entrance was hidden by a thicket of overgrown greasewood, its timbered opening sagging and rotten. It was a dark, forgotten hole in the ground, and it was the safest place Caleb could think of. He led Ellie there on foot, carrying a lantern, a water skin, and a sack of provisions, choosing a path through the rocky arroyos that would hide their tracks. "It is not much," he said, his voice echoing in the narrow entrance. "But no one will find you here. I will bring you more water and food every night. Just stay quiet and keep the lantern low." He settled her inside on a pile of old blankets, the circle of lantern light pushing back a darkness that felt absolute. He saw the terror in her eyes, the fear of being trapped in this cold, suffocating space. "I will be back as soon as it is dark," he promised, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I will not leave you." He left her with the lantern, a jug of water, and a cold hunk of jerky, and rolled a heavy boulder partially in front of the entrance to obscure it. As he walked away, Ellie was left alone with the silence, a profound and terrifying quiet broken only by the slow, rhythmic drip of water somewhere deep in the earth. In Dry Creek, the news of Caleb's defiance spread like a grass fire. Sheriff Abernathy, his pride wounded, made sure his version of the story was told in the saloon. How the tight-lipped rancher was harboring a fugitive, a thief who had run out on her husband. The town, already simmering with the tensions of the drought, quickly chose sides. In the saloon, the arguments were loud and fueled by whiskey. "He is a fool," one man declared, slamming his glass on the bar, risking his whole spread for a runaway wife. "The law is clear. She is the husband's property." Caleb Rowan is not a man who acts without reason, another countered, a grizzled old farmer who had known Caleb for years. If he is protecting her, there is a cause for it. I would trust his judgment over Alistair Hart's money any day. Ruth, at the mercantile, fanned the flames of condemnation. She spoke to the town's women in hushed, scandalized tones, painting Ellie as a wicked seductress who had lured a good man to his ruin. "She has brought a darkness with her," Ruth would say, her eyes glinting with a righteous malice. "He was a pillar of this community. Now look at him, an outlaw in his own home." Most of the women remained silent, their faces impassive. They had seen women with unexplained bruises before. They had heard stories whispered behind closed doors, stories of men who were pillars in public and tyrants in private. They did not defend Ellie, but they did not condemn her either. They simply watched and waited. For Ellie, trapped in the belly of the earth, time ceased to have meaning. The darkness was a living thing, pressing in on her from all sides. The air was thin and cold, smelling of damp rock and decay. The constant drip, drip, drip of water became a form of torture, a clock measuring an eternity of isolation. She slept in short, fitful bursts, waking up with a gasp, unsure if she was in the mine or back in the soundproofed study of her husband's house. The sensory deprivation began to work on her mind, prying open the carefully locked doors of her memory. The darkness began to take on a shape, the familiar, broad-shouldered silhouette of her husband. The dripping water began to sound like his footsteps approaching her room, slow and deliberate. She would squeeze her eyes shut, but she could not block out the images that flooded her mind. A raised hand, a sneer of contempt, the chilling sound of his voice whispering how this was for her own good. She began to hear him in the silence between the drips. "You are nothing without me," the phantom voice would hiss. "Weak, worthless." She would clap her hands over her ears, but the voice was inside her head. The line between memory and reality blurred, then dissolved completely. She was no longer in the mine. She was back in that house, a prisoner of his cruelty, and he was coming for her. When Caleb returned on the third night, he found the mine shaft in utter blackness. The lantern had run out of oil. He called her name softly, but there was no answer. A cold dread seized him. He lit a new lantern and scrambled inside, his heart pounding against his ribs. He found her huddled in the farthest corner, her blankets cast aside, her body trembling violently. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, staring at a shadow on the wall. She was muttering to herself, her words a frantic, nonsensical jumble. "No, please, do not. I will be good. I promise," she whispered to the empty air. "Ellie," he said gently, approaching slowly. She flinched, scrambling backward until she hit the rock wall, a small, terrified cry escaping her lips. "Stay away from me." He saw then that she was not there. She was trapped in a nightmare, reliving the horrors of her past. He knew he could not leave her here. The mine was not a sanctuary. It had become another prison. "It is me, Ellie. It is Caleb," he said, his voice low and steady, a lifeline cast into the storm of her delirium. "I have got you. You are safe now." He reached her and, ignoring her weak struggles, gathered her up in his arms. She was as light as a child, her body burning with fever. He wrapped her in his own coat and carried her out of the suffocating darkness, under the vast, star-filled sky. He did not take her back to the main house, which was too exposed. Instead, he carried her to the hayloft of the barn, a warm, safe space that smelled of sweet grass and cured hay. He laid her down on a soft pile of hay and sat with her, murmuring to her, his voice a constant, calming presence. He held a canteen to her lips, coaxing her to drink. Slowly, slowly, the wild terror in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a dawning, confused recognition. She was not in the mine. She was not in that terrible house. She was in the barn, and Caleb was with her. The warmth of his body next to hers was a solid, reassuring anchor in the swirling chaos of her mind. The fever broke near dawn. Ellie woke up, her mind clear but her body aching and weak. She was tucked under several blankets in the hayloft, and Caleb was asleep in a chair beside her, his head slumped forward, a rifle resting across his lap. The sight of him there, watching over her, sent a wave of emotion so powerful through her that it left her breathless. He had not abandoned her. He had walked into her nightmare and carried her out. She lay there, watching the soft morning light filter through the cracks in the barn walls, and a new feeling began to take root in her heart. It was a fierce, protective tenderness. He was risking everything for her, his ranch, his freedom, his very life. Later, after he had brought her a bowl of warm broth from the house, they sat together in the quiet loft. The air between them was charged with all the things they had not said, the closeness they had shared, born of desperation and trauma, had forged a bond that was deeper than either of them understood. Ellie looked at him, at the tired lines around his eyes, at the resolute set of his jaw. He was a good man, a man of honor, and he was caught in her trap. A sudden, overwhelming urge rose up in her, a desire to give him something other than trouble, to show him that she was more than just a victim to be saved. She reached out and laid her hand on his arm. He did not flinch, but she felt the muscles beneath his sleeve tense. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Caleb," she whispered, and then, before either of them could think, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was not a kiss of pleading or gratitude. It was a kiss of raw, desperate need, a statement of life in the face of so much deathly fear. It was a claiming. For a moment, he was completely still, surprised by her boldness. Then, with a low groan that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul, he responded. His arms went around her, pulling her close, and his mouth met hers with an intensity that mirrored her own. Their passion was not gentle or hesitant. It was a collision, a raw and honest expression of the pain, the loneliness, and the fierce, unspoken longing that had been building between them for months. It was tender, yet desperate, a kiss shaped by shared scars and the terrifying, beautiful realization that they were not alone in their brokenness. They were two survivors, finding a fierce, fragile sanctuary in each other's arms. In the quiet aftermath, as they lay wrapped in blankets in the golden light of the hayloft, a new conflict arose. Caleb was torn, a profound guilt settling over him. He looked at Ellie, her face soft in sleep, and felt like a betrayer. He had taken her in to protect her, to help her heal. Had he just taken advantage of her at her most vulnerable? His desire felt like a fresh wound inflicted upon her. Another man using her for his own needs. He was no better than her husband. The thought was a bitter poison in his soul. But when Ellie awoke and saw the turmoil in his eyes, she understood. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the hard line of his jaw. "Do not," she said softly, "do not think for 1 second that you took anything from me. For 5 years, every touch I knew was about possession. It was about his power, his anger. It was never about me." She sat up, her gaze clear and unwavering. "Tonight, it was the first time I have had a choice, the first time I have felt like my body was my own. You did not take from me, Caleb. You gave me back a piece of myself that I thought he had destroyed forever." Her words were a balm to his conscience, a gift of grace he did not feel he deserved. He looked at her, truly seeing the incredible strength and resilience that had been there all along, hidden beneath the fear. He saw a woman who was not just tougher than fire, but who had been reborn in it. Their fragile peace was shattered by the sound of shouting from the main yard. Caleb peered through a crack in the wall. It was Sheriff Abernathy, and as he had promised, he had a posse of 12 grim-faced men with him. They had come to do it the hard way. Caleb grabbed his rifle. "Stay here," he ordered Ellie. Bar the door!" He did not run. He did not hide. He walked out of the barn and into the center of the yard to face them. A lone man against a small army. "I told you to bring her in, Caleb," the sheriff said, his voice hard. "And I told you she is under my protection," Caleb answered, his voice calm and steady. "That is over," Abernathy declared. "You are under arrest for harboring a fugitive and obstructing justice. Give up now, and it will go easier on you." Caleb did not raise his rifle. He simply stood his ground. "No." That single word was the spark. Two of the deputies rushed him, and the fight began. Caleb fought with a desperate, raw fury, his fists landing with brutal efficiency. He was outnumbered, but he was not easily subdued. He took down one man, then another, but the numbers were too great. They swarmed him, dragging him to the ground, the blows of fists and rifle butts raining down on him. He was bloodied, his face a mask of dirt and gore, but he did not cry out. Several townsfolk, drawn by the commotion, had followed the posse and watched from the edges of the yard. They saw Caleb, a man they respected, being beaten into the dust for defying a law they all knew was flawed. His stubborn, bloody defiance stirred something in them, a grudging admiration, a flicker of doubt about their own silence. A few men started to shift uncomfortably, murmuring to each other. And then, the door to the house opened. Ellie stepped out. She walked calmly, deliberately, into the center of the yard, her head held high. The men beating Caleb stopped, surprised by her sudden appearance. Sheriff Abernathy pointed a finger at her. "There she is! Arrest her!" But before his men could move, Ellie spoke, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the silent yard. "My name is Eleanor Hart," she said, "and I am not a thief. I am a survivor." With a steady hand, she pulled down the collar of her dress, revealing a pale, jagged scar on her shoulder, a permanent reminder of her husband's cruelty. She held out her hands, showing the faint, discolored marks on her wrists. "This is the property Mr. Alistair Hart is so eager to reclaim," she said, her voice trembling with emotion but never breaking. "He calls the law to his side, but his own law is written with his fists in the dark, where no one can see. He claims I stole from him. The only thing I took when I left his house was my life, a life he tried very hard to beat out of me." A wave of shock rippled through the onlookers. It was one thing to whisper about a man's private affairs. It was another to have the proof laid bare in the midday sun. Then, something extraordinary happened. From the back of the crowd, a woman stepped forward. It was the doctor's wife, a quiet, stern woman no one ever crossed. She walked across the yard and came to stand silently beside Ellie. A moment later, another woman, the farmer's wife who had defended Caleb in the saloon, followed suit. Then another, and another. They formed a silent, unmovable wall of calico and denim around Ellie, their faces set, their eyes fixed on the sheriff. They did not speak a word, but their message was deafening. They were done being silent. Sheriff Abernathy looked from the battered, defiant man on the ground to the small, unyielding army of women, and he knew he was defeated. His warrant was just a piece of paper. This was the town's conscience, and it was a force far more powerful. He looked at his posse, their own faces now filled with uncertainty and shame. "Let him up," he muttered, his authority crumbling to dust. He crumpled the warrant in his fist. The law was the law. But today, justice had won. The victory in the yard was a fragile, breathless thing. The posse dissolved, the men shuffling away with their heads down, their purpose lost in the face of a quiet, unshakable truth. The women who had stood with Ellie offered her small, knowing nods before returning to their own lives, leaving behind an unspoken promise of solidarity. Jed and Billy, his legs still splinted but his resolve firm, helped Caleb to his feet. He was a mess of bruises and blood, one eye swollen shut, but he stood tall, his gaze fixed on Ellie, The space between them was charged with everything that had just happened. A new world of possibility dawning in the dust. But peace, in this land, was a fleeting ghost. It had barely settled over the ranch before it was torn apart by the thunder of a dozen horses. Ridden hard and fast, they were not lawmen. They were hard-faced men with rifles held easy across their saddles, their eyes cold and empty. At their lead rode a man who was different. He was dressed in a fine city coat, his face clean-shaven, his posture ramrod straight. He carried himself with an air of absolute ownership, as if the very ground he rode over belonged to him. It was Alistair Hart. Ellie froze. The sight of him, so close, so real, was like a bucket of ice water to her soul. All the strength she had just shown, all the courage she had found, seemed to evaporate. He was her nightmare made flesh, and he had brought his own private army. Alistair reined his horse to a halt just feet from where Caleb and Ellie stood. He surveyed the scene with a look of cold disdain. The battered rancher, the defiant woman, the small, dusty ranch that had dared to harbor what was his. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a low, cultured tone that was more terrifying than any shout. "You have caused a great deal of trouble, for yourself, and for these people." He gestured dismissively at Jed and the other hands who were now emerging from the bunkhouse, their own weapons in hand. "She is not going with you, Hart," Caleb said, his voice a low growl. He stepped forward, placing himself squarely in front of Ellie, a battered shield against the coming storm. Alistair's lips curled into a semblance of a smile. It did not reach his eyes. "I am not here to negotiate with cattlemen," he said. He looked past Caleb, his gaze locking onto Ellie. "You are my wife. You will return to my home. That is the law." He turned his attention to his hired men. "Bring her to me. Kill anyone who stands in your way." The first shot was a deafening crack that shattered the afternoon quiet. It came not from Alistair's men, but from old Jed, whose squirrel rifle appeared in his hands as if by magic. One of the hired guns slumped in his saddle, a look of surprise on his face, before toppling to the ground. And then the world erupted into a chaos of gunfire, shouting, and the terrified screaming of horses. Caleb shoved Ellie toward the house. "Inside! Bar the door!" He grabbed the rifle Jed tossed him and took cover behind a water trough. His movements instinctual, the pain from his earlier beating forgotten in the rush of adrenaline. The ranch hands, outnumbered but fighting for their home, scattered to the scant cover the yard provided, the corner of the barn, the sturdy posts of the corral, a pile of firewood. Ellie stumbled into the house, her heart hammering against her ribs. For a moment, she was paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming terror of the violence outside. The smell of gunpowder was acrid in the air, a scent that dragged her back to the darkest moments of her life. But then she heard a man cry out in pain, one of Caleb's men, and something inside her snapped. She was done being a victim. She was done hiding. She ran to the cabinet where Caleb kept his ammunition. Her hands, which had trembled in Ruth's mercantile, were now steady. She began to load rifles, her movements swift and efficient, a grim, mechanical rhythm. She lined them up on the kitchen table, a Winchester, a Spencer carbine, an old Henry repeater. As soon as a ranch hand would appear at the door, his own weapon empty, she would shove a loaded one into his hands and send him back into the fight. The battle for the ranch was not a noble, heroic affair. It was a desperate, ugly scramble for survival. Dust and smoke filled the air, making it hard to see, hard to breathe. Men grunted and cursed as they fired and reloaded, the explosions of their guns a constant, brutal percussion. One of Alistair's men tried to flank the barn and was met by Billy, who, despite his splinted leg, used a pitchfork with surprising and deadly accuracy. Ellie became the heart of the defense. When one of the hands took a bullet in the arm, she dragged him into the kitchen, cutting away his sleeve with a knife and binding the wound with strips of linen, her face a mask of concentration. She was no longer just the cook. the runaway wife. She was a soldier in a war she had not chosen but would not run from. Amid the chaos, a lone wagon came rattling up the road. It was Ruth, returning from town. She had intended to confront Caleb, to unleash the last of her bitterness and jealousy. But she drove into a war zone. She froze, her face pale with shock, as a stray bullet splintered the sideboard of her wagon. She saw Ellie, her face smudged with dirt and gunpowder. Running from the house to the barn with a loaded rifle, she saw Caleb, his face a bloody mask, fighting with a ferocity that was both terrifying and magnificent. And she saw Alistair Hart, directing his men with a cold, detached cruelty. In that single, terrible moment, Ruth understood everything. She saw the truth of the situation, not as a rivalry for a man's affection, but as a fight between good and evil, between love and possession. She saw one of Alistair's men take aim from behind the cover of a dead horse. He was not aiming at Caleb, or at any of the ranch hands. He was aiming directly at Ellie, who was crouched by the well, trying to give water to a wounded Jed. "Ellie!" Ruth screamed, her voice a raw cry of warning. Without a second thought, she leaped from her wagon and ran, her skirts flying behind her. She did not have a plan. She only had a sudden, overwhelming need to undo the hatred she had harbored for so long. She reached Ellie just as the gunman fired. With a desperate shove, Ruth pushed Ellie to the ground. The bullet that had been meant for Ellie struck Ruth squarely in the chest. Ruth gasped, a look of profound surprise on her face. She stumbled backward, her hand coming up to touch the dark, spreading stain on her dress. She looked at Ellie, her eyes full of 1,000 unspoken things, regret, apology, a final, fleeting understanding. Then her legs gave way, and she collapsed into the dust. Her bitterness was redeemed by a single, selfless act of courage. Ellie stared in horror, the world slowing down around her. The roar of the battle faded to a dull hum in her ears. She crawled to Ruth's side, but it was too late. Ruth's eyes were already vacant, staring up at the mercilessly blue sky. The sight of Ruth's sacrifice, of this woman who had hated her giving her life for her, ignited a rage in Ellie that burned hotter than any fear she had ever known. But before she could react, Alistair, enraged by his men's failure, decided to finish the job himself. He strode through the chaos, pulling a pistol from his coat, his eyes fixed on Ellie with a look of murderous possession. Caleb saw him coming. He roared Ellie's name and threw himself forward, moving to intercept. He was too far away to stop Alistair, but he could put himself between them. He reached Ellie just as Alistair raised his pistol. Caleb shoved her behind him, turning to face her husband. The gun fired. Caleb grunted, a sharp exhalation of breath, and staggered, a dark circle blossoming on his shirt, high on his chest. He had shielded her, taking the bullet meant to end her life. He fell to his knees, his rifle clattering to the ground. The world swam before his eyes, the edges darkening. As he fell, a stray shot from one of the ranch hands struck a lantern hanging on the barn wall. It exploded, and in seconds, the dry, hay-filled barn was engulfed in flames. The fire spread with terrifying speed, the roaring flames a monstrous echo of the battle. The hired guns, seeing their leader's single-minded fury and the ranch now turning into a fiery death trap, began to lose their nerve. They had been paid to fight, not to die. One by one, they broke and fled, melting away into the plains, leaving Alistair alone amid the wreckage of his vengeance. Ellie's world had shrunk to the man kneeling in the dust before her. Grief and terror warred within her. She grabbed Caleb under the arms, her slight frame straining with the effort, and dragged him away from the encroaching heat of the burning barn. She pulled him to the relative safety of the open yard, the ranch he had built as his penance now burning to the ground behind them. She looked up and saw Alistair walking toward them, his face a mask of cold fury. His pistol still in his hand, he had lost his men, but he had not lost his purpose. If he could not have her, no one would. Something inside Ellie went cold and still, All the pain, all the fear, all the rage of the last 5 years coalesced into a single, sharp point of action. She scrambled for Caleb's fallen rifle, her movements sure and steady. She raised it to her shoulder, the stock fitting against her as if it were an extension of her own body. She sighted down the long barrel, and for the first time in her life, she held her husband's life in her hands. He stopped, seeing the rifle pointed at his heart. He saw the woman he had tried to break, now holding the power of life and death over him. A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps even fear, crossed his face. "You will not do it, Eleanor," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "You are too weak." Her finger tightened on the trigger. Her whole being screamed at her to pull it, to end the source of her pain, to claim the vengeance she was owed. She saw Ruth's face, Caleb's blood, the flames devouring their home. It would be so easy. It would be justice. But then a voice, weak and raspy, cut through her rage. It was Caleb, barely conscious, his hand reaching out to touch her arm. "Ellie, no," he whispered, his breath ragged. "You do not need to become what hurt you." His words struck her with the force of a revelation. He was right. Killing him would not heal her. It would only make her like him, a creature of violence and hate. It would be his final victory, to turn her into a mirror of himself. With a choked sob, she lowered the rifle, the strength draining out of her. She had chosen. She would not let him destroy her soul. Alistair saw her hesitation, her moment of mercy, and saw it as weakness. With a roar of pure, possessive rage, he lunged at her, his hands outstretched like claws, ready to finish what he had started. He never reached her. From the side, a figure moved with surprising speed. It was Jed, his face a grim mask of fury. The old ranch hand, who had seen his home destroyed and his friends shot down, brought the stock of his own rifle around in a vicious arc, catching Alistair squarely on the side of the head. There was a sickening crack, and Alistair's heart crumpled to the ground. His reign of terror ended not by his victim's hand, but by the loyalty of a simple, decent man. As if on a cosmic cue, the sky, which had been a clear, empty blue all day, began to darken. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, and then the first drop of rain fell, hitting the dusty ground with a small puff. It was followed by another, and another, until a steady, determined downpour began to fall from the heavens. The drought was over. The rain hissed against the burning barn, turning the smoke to steam, extinguishing the flames. It washed the blood from the dust, cleansing the land. Ellie did not notice. Her world was Caleb, lying so still in the newly formed mud. She knelt beside him, her hands pressing against the wound in his chest, trying vainly to stop the bleeding. The rain mingled with the tears that streamed down her face. "Caleb, please," she wept, her voice breaking. "Please do not leave me. Not now. Do not leave me alone." His eyes fluttered open, and he managed a faint, pained smile. He raised a hand, his fingers barely brushing her cheek, his touch a ghostly caress against her wet skin. He whispered, his voice so faint she had to lean close to hear it over the sound of the rain. "Sweetheart, you are tougher than fire." The rain that had extinguished the fire also brought a resurrection. Weeks turned into a month, and the land, so long starved and cracked, drank deeply and answered with a startling, vibrant green. The creeks ran full and clear, and the air, once thick with dust, now carried the sweet, loamy scent of life. On the Rowan Ranch, the sound of hammers replaced the echo of gunfire. The barn, a blackened skeleton after the fire, was slowly being reborn. New, pale timbers rose against the sky, a testament to the stubborn refusal of the people here to be erased. The work was slow, arduous, but every newly placed plank was a victory. Every driven nail a declaration of permanence. Caleb moved through this flurry of reconstruction with a new, deliberate gait, The bullet from Alistair's pistol had torn through muscle and shattered a piece of his collarbone. The doctor from town had saved his arm, but not his stride. He now walked with a noticeable limp, a permanent, physical reminder of the price of their survival. The injury forced a reliance on others that was foreign to him. He could no longer lift the heaviest beams or spend 10 hours in the saddle. Instead, he directed the work, his voice quiet but his authority absolute. He learned to lean on Jed, whose loyalty was as solid as the granite hills, and on the other hands who had fought for him, for their home. The limp, which could have been a mark of weakness, became instead a symbol of his sacrifice, earning him a deeper respect from his men. While Caleb oversaw the rebuilding of the ranch's bones, Ellie became its heart and its mind. The role of cook, once her only refuge, expanded until it encompassed the entire domestic operation of the ranch. But she did not stop there. One evening, she found Caleb hunched over his account ledgers, his face tight with pain and frustration as he tried to make sense of the figures with his one good arm. Without a word, she had pulled the book toward her. Her education back east, a thing she had thought useless in this rough country, had included bookkeeping. From that night on, the ledgers were hers. She managed the accounts with a meticulous, sharp-witted clarity that surprised everyone. She calculated the cost of lumber, bargained with the freight agent in town for better rates on supplies, and figured out how to pay the men's wages and still have enough left over to buy new breeding stock. She proved herself to be more than capable. She was indispensable. The men, who had once whispered about the mysterious woman in the kitchen, now came to her with their questions, treating her not as the boss's woman, but as a boss in her own right. The shy, frightened creature who had hidden in a desolate shack was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her own worth and was not afraid to show it. The town of Dry Creek had undergone a transformation of its own. When Ellie rode in for supplies now, the silence that greeted her was no longer one of condemnation, but of a quiet, profound respect. The story of the showdown at the ranch had become local legend. The standoff with the sheriff, the courage of the town's women, the final, brutal battle, and Ellie's role in it all. They had seen her bruised and hunted, and then they had seen her stand and fight, not just for herself, but for the man who had sheltered her and the home they had built. They saw a survivor. The doctor's wife would stop her on the street to ask after Caleb's recovery, her questions full of genuine concern. The farmer who had spoken up for Caleb in the saloon would tip his hat and offer her a warm, sincere smile. People no longer looked through her. They looked at her, and in their eyes, she saw an acceptance she had never thought possible. One afternoon, she bought a small bundle of wildflowers from a girl on the street and rode the wagon out to the small, dusty cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. She found Ruth's grave, marked by a simple wooden cross. The bitterness Ellie had once felt toward the woman was gone, washed away by the blood and the rain. She knelt and placed the flowers on the packed earth. She did not know what to say, so she simply stayed there for a long time, a silent communion of gratitude and forgiveness for the woman whose final act had been one of unexpected, redemptive grace. The bond between Ellie and Caleb deepened in the quiet moments between the hard days of work. Their relationship was no longer that of a savior and the saved. The roles had blurred, then disappeared entirely, replaced by a partnership of equals, forged in the crucible of shared hardship. They were two flawed, scarred people who had found in each other a place of rest. Some evenings they would sit on the porch of the half-rebuilt house, the new lumber smelling of pine and promise, and watch the sun set. They did not need many words. A shared look, a comfortable silence, the simple act of him reaching for her hand. These things spoke a language far deeper than speech. He saw the woman who had faced down her own demons and his, and had emerged with a spirit as resilient as the prairie grass. She saw the man who had been willing to sacrifice everything for her, a man whose quiet strength was the bedrock on which she had rebuilt her life. The passion that had ignited in the hayloft had not faded. It had simply settled, transforming into a slow-burning ember of deep, abiding love that warmed them both against the memory of the cold. One evening, as the sky began to bleed into the soft hues of twilight, Ellie saddled a horse. She felt a strange pull, a need to return to the place where it had all begun. Caleb saw her riding out and, without a word, mounted his own horse and followed at a distance. He knew where she was going. She rode to the desolate canyon, its jagged edges softened by the evening light. The land around it was no longer a cracked, barren wasteland. It was covered in a soft carpet of green, dotted with the vibrant colors of spring wildflowers. She dismounted near the crumbling remains of the old shack, the place that had been both her prison and her sanctuary. It looked smaller now, less menacing. It was just a place, a collection of rotting wood that no longer held any power over her. Caleb rode up and stopped his horse beside hers. He did not speak, simply watched her, his gaze full of a quiet understanding. Ellie turned to face him, the golden light of the setting sun catching in her hair. "I was so scared that day," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I thought I would die here. I thought all there was in the world was pain and fear, my whole life. I was taught that love meant possession, that it meant being owned. It was a cage, and the man who held the key was the one who hurt you the most." She took a step closer to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "And then you came. You did not try to fix me. You did not try to save me. Not really. You just made space for me. You let me be broken. You showed me that a person's touch could be gentle. You taught me that silence could be a comfort, not a threat." She reached out and laid her hand on his chest, right over his heart. She could feel its steady, rhythmic beat beneath her palm. "You taught me that love does not have to be a gentle, quiet thing," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It can burn. It can be fierce and wild and hurt sometimes. But you taught me that it can also heal, that the same fire that scars you can also forge you into something stronger." She looked up into his eyes, her love for him a vast, open thing. "Thank you, Caleb. Thank you for teaching me that love doesn't mean pain, that it can burn and heal at once." He did not answer with words. He simply lowered his head and kissed her. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of the hayloft. It was a kiss of profound peace, of absolute certainty. It was a promise, made under the fading sun, that they were finally, truly home. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, as the land around them turned to gold, alive and breathing and full of hope. The same wind that had once scoured the plains and thrown dust in the face of a lonely, fleeing woman now blew gently through the canyon, carrying the scent of wildflowers. The same harsh land that had promised nothing was now offering a future. But this time, they faced it together. The West never forgave us, but love never asked it to. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with each other. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.